So realizing young people's rights through digital regulation, my honor and joy to introduce to you Rys Farthing from Reset Tech Australia. I encourage everyone to go to Rys's personal website, rysfarthing.com, where you'll get a lot of information. So for Rebecca Herald, you're there for privacy and security. And of course, there are some overlaps here with Rys's work on children and youth and rights and technology. She's an international speaker, graduated from Oxford University, and many other accolades in academia, as well as a teaching career, a research career, and incredible outputs, both in media for advocacy. Here's an opinion piece that recently aired. We need to protect children from harms of social media. Again, another piece here from the University of Melbourne in its pursuit. Data protection is a mental health issue for young people with Piers Gooding, Rys and Emily Painter, and so many other outlets. I mean, Rys is an advisor to so many organizations, has published her own work, which is very well cited. She could be in academia as a professor if she wanted to, and she could also be in an advocacy role, but also in an NGO role. This is the perfect person. Both you, Rebecca, and Rys are in this overlap of volunteerism, but also incredible work that you're doing in your domains, both in security and in this instance, youth and politics. I met Rys when she was the director at Five Rights Organization in the UK, and we were working together on a standard that's just gone live and public today. That standard is Age-Appropriate Digital Services Framework based on the 5 Rights Principles for Children. But Rys is here to share with us something different today, and the floor is yours, Rys.
Brilliant, thank you. And thank you for that introduction, Katina. I'm definitely going to ask you to write my next CV or job application. I'm not 100% sure. I recognized myself almost in that description, and I hope to live up to maybe the audience can sort of lower the bar of expectations a little bit in their mind, but hopefully we can live up to it somewhat. But hello everyone. As Katina mentioned, my name is Rys, and I'm currently the Director of Children's Policy at Reset Australia. That's I guess you describe it as a think and do tank that looks at digital regulation and in the broadest sense, countering digital threats to democracy, and that includes the ability of people to realise their rights online. And thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you today. I think one of the joys of COVID, if there can be any, is that the forced move of everything onto Zoom and digital spaces means that we get to foster these sorts of global get-togethers far more easily, and it's such a delight to speak to people from different parts of the world. I'm currently in London, hence the doomy, gloomy, dark background. It may only be 6 p.m, but those of you who are familiar with London's winter means that means it is pitch black and almost icy outside. So bear with me. I've been asked to speak to you a little bit about children's rights and digital regulation, which I know is a bit of a niche topic almost, but I'm hoping that I can make that seem both intelligible and critical. I've got half an hour, but I can't imagine that anyone wants to hear from me for that long. So I'm going to try and speak for about 10-15 minutes and then open it up for questions, if that sounds good. But also put your hands up either sort of digitally or even analog, or drop something in the chat if you've got a question as we go. I'm really keen to have a discussion rather than sort of give a presentation or anything. So jump in and let's see how we go. I'll start, if I can, by describing how I see the digital world, or to see if it's a useful framing for children and young people. I always think of the digital world as, akin to the non-digital world, if there is one anymore, but that it's a sort of ecosystem of risks and opportunities for young people. And I think it's really important to sort of start by stating out that there are opportunities, there are huge opportunities in the digital world for young people, because quite often when we talk about the risks, we start to get on this sort of like, oh gosh, the risks keep young people off the internet, like keep them away from the digital world. But we always need to sort of emphasize the flip side too, and flag that there are huge benefits for young people from the digital world. But out of necessity, I think there's been a real focus on what those risks are for young people. And I'm absolutely sure that everyone on this call will have heard about some of these risks in one way or another. And a lot of them has frightened the sort of heebie-jeebies out of most of us. You hear something, you're like, oh God, that's not right. But there are just loads of risks that we've heard about. I'm going to give us two types of frameworks to understand these risks. Really broadly, I think in the sort of Weberian sense of creating ideal types of risks, frameworks that almost give us stereotypes to think about these risks. I'm going with two frameworks today, partly because I think that one is a more global framework, and that's so important to keep in mind when we talk about children and young people in the digital world. This is a global world we live in. And then the other framework, I think, is a slightly narrower sense of the risks that young people in the OECD world contend with that we might sort of more traditionally think of risks. This should make sense when I share my screen and show you a slide. I promise I've only got 2 slides. So it's not a slide heavy show to keep us hopefully chatting. Now, how do I share screen? The big green button that says share screen. Yes, that one. Here we go. And then I click on this. You'd think I'd be faster at this by now, but no, here we go. All right. So the first, can everyone, oh, that's the next one. Can everyone see? All right, brilliant. So the first framework that we've got to talk about or to think about risks is from a child rights perspective. And from a sort of child rights perspective, building from the Convention on the Rights of the Child, there's a sort of non-technical typology of sort of clusters of rights that emerge: provision, protection, and participation. So in terms of provision, this is really talking about the fact that children have the rights to adequate provisions for them. And in a world where globally so few children have access to reliable high-speed internet or up-to-date technologies, it's really important to think about the risks of provision as well, because this can sort of create a digital exclusion and inequality for many young people right around the world. And that in itself is a risk. There are risks for not being able to access technology. There's also participation risks involved in the digital world. And this sort of stems from thinking about the right that children have to participate in decision-making processes that affect them. And sometimes these rights to participate are actually realized through technology in ways that the analog world doesn't. So, I've seen technology used to enable global summits, to run online consultations for young people to be able to have their say in ways that traditional political environments just aren't open to young people. So there's opportunities there. But there's also risks. I think if you think about realizing young people's rights in technology rather than through technology, there just simply aren't enough young people involved in conversations about broadband rollout plans or data protection regulations or all of the other rules that we're making around the digital world. It's very rare that young people have a say in those, despite the fact that the digital world is as much theirs, if not more so, than it is ours. But then lastly, from a sort of rights-based perspective, there's protection rights. And this stems from the CRC. They're often broken up and split down into the right to survival and the right to development. Fundamentally, what this is the right to be safe, the right to live and grow. And this is where many of the risks that we talk about when we talk about online risks really sort of in OECD countries reside. And of these types of risks, we tend to break them down into a category in the online safety, children's online safety world. We break it down into a category which we call the 4 Cs. I think just because we've managed to work out a way to make them all start with C, so it's a snappy acronym. But basically there are risks of contact risks that emerge from the digital world. And this is like what we traditionally called stranger danger. So things like platforms recommending stranger adults as friends to children, or enabling messaging between, children and young people, children and adults in sort of hidden and encrypted ways. There's also content risks, which is there's a huge focus on this at the moment. So that's the risk of seeing harmful content, whether that's just age inappropriate content like, gore and violence or pornography, or it could be just out and out harmful content that's harmful to everyone, like vaccine misinfo or illegal content or terrorist content. There's content risks in there for young people. There's also conduct risks, which is what we tend to call it when young people behave in sort of risky or unpleasant ways online. And so I'm thinking quite squarely here about cyberbullying, the risk of cyberbullying and the awful consequences it can have for young people. But there's also this third category of contract or commercial risks, which is less often spoken about. But this covers everything from some of the security risks that Rebecca would have talked about, like ID fraud, all of those things that can happen if your data is stolen, hacked, and, you end up losing money as a consequence, to the more common sort of, bombardment with surveillance advertising, which in itself is damaging for children as well. So I'm going to stop sharing there. That's the sort of risk framework that we've got. In terms of, I'm just trying to pull up my notes. Where did we go? Escape. There we go. In terms of, thinking about responses that people have made to that risk, I think I'm going to talk a little bit about the response from civil society and the response to governments, the response from governments to these risks. And I'm thinking more so about the 4C type risks here than the child rights risks. But firstly, if you think about the response from civil society, I think it's fair enough to say that because civil society deals with the end users first, we deal with children and young people, we've seen those harms, there's been a real focus on working with those end users, working with children and young people to address the issues that we're seeing through the provision of education and services to children and also to parents. So there's been a huge focus on what we either call online safety training or sometimes digital literacy skills, to encourage and enable children and young people to keep themselves safe online. And some of these have been really local. So we've seen a number of countries, states, regions update their school curriculums to include online safety training. So for example, across Europe, the European Commission had the Safer Internet Programme, which supported the agenda and has meant that online safety is now a feature, a really common feature in most European countries in their school curriculum. In Australia, this sort of training has been so prolific that our e-safety commissioner had to create a sort of certification scheme for them called the Trusted E-Safety Provider Scheme to make sure that all of the provision of this education was reliable and trustworthy. But we've also seen moves to include online safety in the curriculum in Mozambique, in Egypt. It's huge in the Philippines. The Dominican Republic has it in their school system. So all around the world, we've seen this online safety training come up through the curriculum. We've also seen global initiatives like Safer Internet Day, which is celebrated all around the world, including in schools. And then there's some initiatives from like the ITU who have these online safety lessons with a little character called Sangu, which are meant to be global and globally accessible. And they're absolutely fantastic, by the way. Some of these programs have also been funded by big tech. So in the UK, and actually I think in the US as well, we've seen Google has a program called Be Internet Legends. And so together what we're seeing is this, global, local, private sector provision. We're approaching an almost endemic nature of online safety training in our education systems for children and young people. And we didn't forget parents too. There's been loads of information and training for parents about what you can do to keep your family safe online. And there's also been the development of all sorts of parental controls, search filters, all of those tools, tools and the thorny end that parents can actually use to keep their families safe. Now, don't get me wrong when I say what I'm about to say. These are hugely important programs. No one wants a child not to know all the things that they can do to keep themselves safe in the digital world. Education really is empowerment, and we need to keep this up as well. But this approach can really also be used to unfairly responsibilize children and families for their safety. And I'm going to borrow a framework here from risk management in occupational health and safety. It's called the hierarchy of controls, and it is my second slide, if I can share it with you. So we're almost done with slides, I promise. Then she'll never force you to look at my screen again. So if you look at this comes from the world of how to keep your workers safe in line. And it's just a really simple, really common hierarchy of controls. And what it says is that, the first control, the biggest control, the one that's going to make the biggest risk is elimination, to physically eliminate a risk. So if we're thinking about how you'd stop workers, I don't know, getting cut at work or something, you'd be asking questions like, I don't know, do we really need to do this task that requires all these razor blades in the office? Maybe, do we need razor blades to do this job? Can we take the cutting out of our work plan? If your answer is no, you can't eliminate the risk, then you talk about substitution, replacing the hazard, and you're like, okay, fine. Could we find something safer than razor blades to do this cutting job? Maybe, I don't know, like a blunt letter opener or something. If you can't replace it and you really need your razor blades, you're like, okay, fine. Can we isolate people from the hazard? Let's engineer some controls. Do people need to do this? Like, I don't know, could you get a cutting machine in and a machine can do the cutting so your workers are a bit safer? If the answer is not, then you go to what are called administrative controls, where you change the way people work. And this is really about the education piece, right? It's like, can we train our workers to work safer, to handle these razor blades that they have to use in safer ways? And once you've done that, then you move down to PPE, which now has a different meaning after COVID. But I think initially at this stage, they're like, okay, it's the tools, those last things that you can give people to keep themselves safe. So in my example, for some reason, if a workplace that involves razor blades, it would be giving our staff really thick gloves or something, right? And if I give you that as a metaphor, if that's the metaphor for like, how we keep people, well, not even people, how we keep children safe, you can start to see that education and giving parents some tools really starts to focus at that bottom of the triangle. And that's really, really important. But families and children themselves, I just don't think, I think they should be the last line of defense in the discussion around how we keep children safe online. They shouldn't be the ones bearing the most responsibility for keeping themselves safe. So if we think about that, who should be on the front line? Who should be making these changes? Who should be eliminating those risks? That top bar that was, I don't know, was it green, blue, the top blue bar, who should be doing that? And I think that's where two big players merge. One is the tech industry themselves, and the second is government, right? Governments have been deciding rules all the time about what businesses need to do. What are the rules that they need to follow? And we really need to see governments around the world step up to the plate and critically think about the rules that govern the digital world in order to make the digital world safer for children in the first place. And like civil society, their approach has changed over the last few decades as well. We saw this start of early interventions. There were a couple of regulations implemented around the world that really focused on takedown and content moderation. So Australia's Online Safety Act in 2015 that we passed was about flagging content and then requiring content to be taken down really quickly. And again, I think that's a really important approach, but it's not enough. It's just going to leave regulators playing whack-a-mole with bad content. Bad content's going to pop up. Well, issue a takedown notice. It doesn't sort of go upstream. We've also seen early regulation emerging around parental consent, creating sort of minimum ages. And I'm thinking here specifically around COPPA in the US, which may have been useful 20 odd years ago, at least in that it put a flag in the sand to mark out children's data as somehow different to adults' data, and you need to treat it differently. But again, it's not quite enough for the modern data-rich world. But the cheery news that I'm trying to bring, I mean, it's hard to talk about online safety and be a cheery, positive speaker, but I'm going to try it. Is just to point out that all of this learning and evolution in approaches is starting to see regulation move upstream. We're starting to see regulation that looks at the way technology systems and products function. And this is where we're starting to see governments talk about making rules that eliminate the harms, making rules that require tech companies to start looking at that big top blue section of the pyramid. So what are some examples of this upstream harm? In the UK, we had the Age Appropriate Design Code, which came into force in September this year, and that required data, which is the center of a lot of these business models and practices, to only be collected and processed where it was in children's best interests. So it put children's rights at the center and required tech companies to think about them in the way they build their products to start with. And this, we've seen a lot of early changes from this. So like TikTok and Instagram defaulting children's accounts to private, really simple ones to more systemic changes like requiring companies to do data protection impact assessments before they develop a product. So they have to think before they build it about, all right, what does this mean for children? Similar guidance, not law, but guidance has been passed in Sweden, the Netherlands, and France. Ireland's got some draft code coming out around that as well. In the US, there's moves afoot insofar as legislative moves can happen in the US, but there's 2 bills in front of Congress at the moment. Kathy Carter's got a Privacy Act in front of the House, and Senator Blumenthal's got a Kids Act in front of the Senate. And both of these propose variants of the best interest principle into regulation that would let the FTC oversee, I guess, how to make sure that digital services and products function in children's best interest. And in Australia too, Hometown Pride, we've currently got a draft exposure bill open for consultation that would introduce children's best interests into data regulation as well. And where regulation moves, tech developers follow. Well, I mean, they have to, I guess. But I also like to imagine that public interest technologists are also moving too, and also looking in their own right at ways that they can develop and build products that advance children's rights in the way that they operate. So that's my kind of upbeat message for today, that there are ways to regulate and indeed build digital systems and functions that advance children's rights. And that while we definitely need more of this, and I will be a vociferous and angry advocate from the civil society, screaming for more of this, delightfully, we do start to be seeing movement around this in parts. So I'm just wondering, I'll open it up for questions, comments, thoughts. Or should we hold them to the end, Katina? I leave that to you.
We've got a minute. I reckon we could do it now.
I have a question. So if I removed the digital social platforms from our teenage daughter, how should I take a digital literacy class, or should I have her take the digital literacy class? Because you did mention there is risk and opportunities, and I don't want to take that opportunity away from her, but I want her to understand the risk.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't, if your daughter's over 13 and has a social media account and has a mobile phone, there's a lot of evidence that suggests that taking that away from them actually can be quite traumatic and quite damaging. It is part of their life. It's part of their communication network. So I'd be very cautious about removing anything. And indeed, I don't think that children should be out of the digital world. I think they should be in it. In terms of what you can do to keep yourself safe, educating yourself, educating your daughter, both really helpful things. But fundamentally, I think we've got to go upstream. I think, the biggest and best thing you could do would be write to your representative and tell them that, like, the way the digital world operates is insane. And it's insane that my daughter has to go to a course to keep herself safe when, Facebook and Google are worth trillions of dollars. How come they can't employ some of their coders and developers to make these products safer in the first place?
Thank you for that.
I mean, appreciate that's not as short term, and definitely make sure you also do stuff in your house around safety, talk to your daughter, make sure all of that's there, but also, upstream stuff as well.
Yeah, we do talk to her about the safety, but she did mention some things on social media that we weren't proud of, especially on TikTok.
Yeah. And Anna, I think this is something that most parents are battling with, but also most young people. Rys, could you comment further on that, just from your youth work that you've done in the field with so many young people who are teenagers?
Yeah, I mean, I talk to young people all the time, and they're sort of slightly exasperated by what happens. We quite often, we sort of like, you've got to keep yourself safe, be cautious. And they're like, yep. And like yesterday, 15 random men messaged me on Instagram, and you're like, yes. Well, that is, pardon my French, that is crap. Obviously you need to delete those messages, report them, don't reply, all of those things. but fundamentally, like, I don't quite understand why those platforms allow that to routinely happen, and they are making steps and moves. So, you know, young people are as equally frustrated by how difficult it is to keep themselves safe as adults are, I think. And so I think there's a real will from young people for change.
Rebecca, do you have a comment on that as well from your background?
Yeah, so with regard to making sure that data can be removed, that would be wonderful. It's important to remember, though, that anything that's been posted online can have been captured by someone else, like Snapchat is a great example. People were doing screenshots of those images so that those were shared elsewhere at other times, even though they only lasted for a few minutes or whatever. So that's something to discuss with, you know, your children as well. The fact that even if they think something goes away in a few minutes, it may not have really gone away because somebody else might have went ahead and captured it using some other type of tool.
Thank you.
Any final comments, Rys, before we move on to the next speaker?
No, just it was thank you for listening to me. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for raising the importance of regulation and more this ability to do mass change rather than change in pockets.